Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Premier Biotech entitled Why the Drug Testing Market is Shifting to Oral Fluid. I'm Jessica Polk of the Current Consulting Group, and I'll be conducting today's presentation entitled Why the Drug Testing Market is Shifting to Oral Fluid. Today's presentation qualifies for continuing education from HRCI, SHRM, and from CCDAP for those who attend today's presentation in its entirety. You will receive information following today's webinar on how to apply for those credits. We're excited to hear from today's webinar sponsor, Premier Biotech. So I'll go ahead and turn the virtual microphone over to Casey Mahalik from Premier Biotech to tell us a little bit about them and also to introduce us to today's presenter.
Thanks, Jessica. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Casey Mahalik, and I'm the Chief Experience Officer at Premier Biotech. We are incredibly excited to partner with Bill Current and Current Compliance Group and looking forward to the content presented in today's webinar. A little bit about Premier Biotech. We are the manufacturer of OralTox, which is how we're best known in the workplace market. And really, what we're trying to do is change the game in pre-employment drug testing by providing a solution that expedites the hiring process and provides a way to do it much more cost effectively than traditional collection methods, whether it's leveraging traditional urine collection sites or patient service centers or laboratory-based oral fluid testing. So essentially, the idea is we manufacture a rapid oral fluid test where we have a result nearly instantaneously within minutes, and we're able to expedite the hiring process, get the negatives to work immediately, oftentimes same day, and again at a fraction of the cost. And again, just changing the way that drug testing is conducted. OralTox has been around since 2012, and we sell tens of millions of these every year to companies in the retail, staffing, hospitality, construction, manufacturing, logistics space. In 2019, we launched our OT Scan app, which is an algorithm that automates the test interpretation and takes the subjectivity out of the test. So essentially, you have all the benefits of oral fluid testing, which we'll hear Bill speak of the specifics of why we're seeing this market shift to rapid oral fluid testing. But with the combination or leveraging this OT Scan app, now we have the additional benefit of an automated test interpretation, taking the subjectivity out of the test, as well as electronic documentation, and ultimately integration back into an applicant tracking system as well. So again, we are Premier Biotech, the manufacturer of OralTox device. We're sponsoring today's webinar, and we are incredibly excited to present Bill Current to speak to the shift that we're seeing in the market towards oral fluid testing, and specifically rapid oral fluid testing. And so I'll go ahead and introduce Bill Current, who founded the Current Consulting Group in 1998. It has become very quickly one of the most recognized brands in compliance, business development, and operations consulting in the drug testing industry. Bill created Current Compliance and the most up-to-date, comprehensive online subscription database to all state laws related to workplace drug testing. So without further ado, I will pass the microphone over to Bill Current. And again, we sincerely appreciate your participation in today's webinar.
Well, thank you very much, Casey, and welcome everyone to today's webinar presentation. I'm going to pause on my favorite slide here for just a moment to say that Current Consulting Group is celebrating its 25th anniversary. So we've been in business a long time. And every year for 25 years, we have conducted a survey of the drug testing industry. And we just presented the results of our 2023 survey at the NDASA conference just a couple of weeks ago in Bellevue, Washington. And as part of that survey, we conduct sort of a survey within the survey on brand name recognition. We ask the people who participate, who are all people in the industry, you know, what are the top 3 recognized brands? And then we go through categories. What's the top 3 recognized brands for lab-based urine testing, for lab-based oral fluid testing, for point of collection urine testing, for MRO services, et cetera, et cetera. And I just want to give kudos to Premier Biotech because they were voted the #1 recognized brand in rapid result oral fluid testing this year. And that's no small achievement because there's a lot of companies out there, a lot of brands out there. And to rise to the top like that in this industry, a very competitive industry, is really quite an accomplishment. So One, we're very happy to be doing this webinar together today with Premier Biotech, and also to take this opportunity to congratulate them on finishing #1 as the #1 recognized brand in rapid result oral fluid testing. And it happens at a time when oral fluid testing is really sort of the talk of the industry. So this is the agenda I'm gonna follow. I'm gonna present a few table setting slides, so to speak, to get us started. And then we'll talk about why the federal government has recently endorsed oral fluid testing, including DOT. We'll look at some state law examples because that's one of the really key issues right now is, which states allow oral fluid testing and which don't. And the answer is virtually every state allows oral fluid testing, but I'll walk you through that. Then we'll do a little comparison of oral fluid and urine testing. I'm still a big fan of urine testing as well, but we're going to talk about how oral fluid testing has really sort of increased in popularity and the role that the federal government endorsements have played in that. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to implement an effective pilot program in case you want to try oral fluid testing first. It's like test driving a car before you make your long-term financial purchase. Okay, so first let's launch by talking a little bit about the state of oral fluid testing today. Now, I've been in the drug testing business for 34 years. It's hard to believe that much time has passed, but I've been doing this since my first job at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce back in 1989, and now this year will be my 34th year come October. That's when I'll celebrate my 34th year in the business. And for many years, and every year really, we're talking about emerging technologies in the industry, but for many years, oral fluid testing was really considered by many people to still be an emerging technology. Not quite there yet, but coming on. And now today it's in common use in some industries. And the advantages of oral fluid testing, I think, align very well with some of the modern day challenges that employers are facing when it comes to continuing to do their testing. I'll talk a little bit about some of those challenges here in a second. But the sort of advent of oral fluid testing aligns with things that are happening right now that are making traditional urine testing much more difficult. I've got some examples coming up. But 3 significant trends, I think, have really sort of opened the door wide for oral fluid testing. First, in October of 2019, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration endorsed oral fluid testing when it released its final guidelines for oral fluid testing of federal employees and federal workplaces. So basically, they added to 49 CFR Part 40 a component for oral fluid drug testing. At that time, those particular guidelines were only for federal workers and the testing of federal workers. But we all know that 49 CFR Part 40 is the framework for all federally mandated drug testing, like the DOT regulations. So that really created an opening for the Department of Transportation to really finalize a process that had been going on for many years that would eventually result in a final rule for oral fluid testing of DOT covered employers in the private sector. And so in May of this year, just last month, DOT finally, after many years, issued a final rule on oral fluid testing, which will now allow, when certain conditions are met, covered employers that are covered under the DOT drug and alcohol testing regulations to choose between oral fluid testing and urine testing, or to create a combination of the two, depending on what their needs and circumstances are. Now, I said there are some conditions, right? You see in that second bullet there, what the DOT regulations went into effect this week officially, but they are pending the certification of at least 2 laboratories by SAMHSA to conduct oral fluid testing. So today, there are not 2 laboratories certified by SAMHSA for oral fluid testing, but the regulations are there and will now begin to serve as a blueprint for how employers conduct oral fluid testing, whether it's DOT mandated or mandated by some other government entity, or a non-DOT, non-mandated program, as well as a point of collection testing program versus a lab-based testing program. The DOT regulations, this final rule, will sort of serve as a blueprint to help companies create the most legally defensible, efficient, effective program, because it's based on guidelines from the federal government. Now, state laws will come into effect, and I've got a whole section coming up on that. So let's hold off on that for a second. But the third trend, I think, that is pushing the market toward oral fluid testing is the legalization of marijuana. Today, there are 40 states that have legalized marijuana, either for medicinal purposes or for what's called recreational or adult use marijuana. And that has put employers in a tough spot, right? Because now marijuana is legal in many states, especially the states that have legalized it for recreational purposes, causing employers to really sort of look at whether or not they have the right to pry into the private lives of their employees. Now, this was the same debate that existed in the early 1990s when I was very young in the industry. What right do employers really have to know what their employees do on their own time? And the argument was sort of settled with the fact that marijuana in particular, but other drugs as well, were illegal. And so their use was illegal, and coming to work under the influence was illegal, and bringing marijuana to use while at work was illegal. And so the debate was really short-lived, because it was very clear that employers did have the right to ensure that their workers were drug-free when they were working. Now, with the legalization of marijuana, employers are sort of looking at a way to keep doing drug testing without prying too far back into the private behavior of their employees. And that's where oral fluid, with some of its very unique attributes, comes into play. The shorter window of detection, the ability to detect drug use almost immediately after someone smokes a joint, for example. Those are unique qualities to oral fluid testing that you don't get with urine, and you don't get with hair, and you don't get with other testing methods. So some states have passed marijuana laws that have specific non-discriminatory language in them that really directs an employer toward a drug testing method with the ability to detect recent use with a much shorter window of detection, because then you can kind of create, in conjunction with other things that are happening in the workplace, like accidents and episodes of violence and contention, maybe employee theft, etc. You can combine those with a positive drug test result with an oral fluid test that has that shorter, tighter window of detection. I've got a slide on that coming up, so that you can make the case that this individual is a threat to the safety and the well-being of the workplace, more so than perhaps under other circumstances. So those are the three significant trends that we're looking at that have sort of, I think, catapulted oral fluid into a higher sphere of popularity. Now, I mentioned that every year the Current Consulting Group conducts a survey of the drug testing industry. We also happen to do a drug testing survey of employers' drug testing practices, and we'll release those results, the results of that survey, a little later in the year. But over the last couple of years, we've seen a dramatic increase in the percentage of drug testing providers who say they now offer oral fluid testing. Just in 2019, when in answer to that question, do you provide oral fluid drug testing, only 36% of people in our survey, which is usually hundreds of companies in the drug testing industry, only 36% said that they offer oral fluid testing. In 2019, it increased to, or excuse me, that was in 2019. In 2022, it had increased to 85%, 85.6%, a dramatic increase in a very, very short period of time. Now, we didn't ask the question exactly the same way in the 2023 survey, but we did ask the question, in the future, which drug testing method will be most used? And 45.6% said urine, and 45.6% said oral fluid testing. Now, and what's interesting about those results is that, and we'd only asked this question a couple of times over the years, but not very long ago. But if we had asked this question even 10 years ago, oral fluid testing would have been a small percentage compared to urine. urine probably would have been 80% and oral fluid testing would have been 10 or 12% perhaps. Now, in the old days of doing the survey, we would ask certain experts to offer their opinion on certain things about the future of drug testing. And I remember asking, you know, what chance does oral fluid testing have in the future? And, you know, a very bold response was something like 25% of all drug testing will be oral fluid sometime in the future. This was a question that I asked probably 20 years ago. But there was this one guy, I won't say his name, he's not in our industry anymore, but there was one guy who said in the future, 80% of all drug tests will be oral fluid. And it was really sort of an outlier response, you know, not a lot of people, you know, came anywhere close to 80%. But we know that with the advent of oral fluid testing in the federal regulations, which I'm going to talk about in detail here in a second, a lot more people are open-minded to the idea of an alternative testing method. And so the two methods today, in the view of people in the drug testing business, are neck and neck at 45% each. Now, a lot of that has to do with the fact that the federal government has now endorsed oral fluid testing. First SAMHSA in 2019, and then DOT with a notice of proposed rulemaking in 2022, and then the final regulations that just came out. So you've got lab-based urine testing that's been around for 30 plus years and has been the only testing method allowed by DOT for 3 decades. And now oral fluid testing, which was endorsed by SAMHSA in 2019, approved officially by DOT in 2023, of course, pending the certification of 2 laboratories. And it makes oral fluid testing now the only federally endorsed drug testing method capable of detecting recent use. So with urine testing, there's a lag time, but with oral fluid testing, because you're detecting the parent drug, drugs become, like marijuana, for example, becomes detectable in an oral fluid sample within about 10 to 15 minutes. Hair testing, much different, right? There's a lag time of several days before drugs become detectable in a hair sample. So the really sort of the 2 primary testing methods are urine testing, oral fluid testing, with hair testing, and a notice of proposed rulemaking from SAMHSA back in 2020 that we've not seen a lot of progress with yet, but really on the horizon, let's say. Now, when SAMHSA put out its final guidelines for oral fluid testing in October 2019, they articulated several reasons why they felt oral fluid testing was ready for the big time, let's say. So there was the enhanced flexibility. They really focused on that, the ability to choose, to give employers the ability to choose between urine and oral fluid testing. They liked that. The enhanced versatility, oral fluid testing can be collected, you know, an oral fluid sample can be collected anywhere, anytime, which is very, very popular with companies with, say, remote locations that are where it's difficult to access an offsite collection facility to void a urine sample, or to companies that run, you know, 24-hour shifts and they've got people working at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning that may need to be drug tested. Decreased invalid tests. It's virtually impossible, not impossible, but virtually impossible to cheat on an oral fluid test, and certainly in the same ways that people for many years have cheated on urine tests. It's very common in a urine test to try to subvert the process, but with oral fluid testing, very difficult. Federal government really liked that. It saves time and money if you're able to do the collections on site, and it's the versatility and the detection. Now, I think personally, having done this for so many years, that the most insightful and significant thing that's ever been said about oral fluid testing was a quote from SAMHSA that came out in 2019 regarding the science of oral fluid testing. So rather than paraphrase it, I'm just going to read it. But this was in the Federal Register back in October of 2019. The scientific basis for the use of oral fluid as an alternative specimen for drug testing has now been broadly established, and the advances in the use of oral fluid in detecting drugs have made it possible for this alternative specimen to be used in federal programs with the same level of confidence that has been applied to the use of urine. I mean, to me, that is the most significant endorsement that I think has ever been made when it comes to oral fluid testing. The science has always been debated when it comes to drug testing, whether it's urine or hair or oral fluid. But from a scientific standpoint, from a technological standpoint, the debate ended for urine testing a long time ago. And I think it ended for oral fluid testing a while back as well. But now you have the statement from the federal government saying the scientific basis is now been broadly established, and employers can use oral fluid with the same level of confidence that has been applied to urine testing in the past. That's a significant statement. And so when DOT put out their guidelines just last month, they talked about many of the same things: combating adulteration and substitution issues, the drug test cheating problem, the fact that all collections can be directly 100% observed, which creates potential cost savings without having to have invalid tests that need to be recollected, as well as just the time that it takes to send somebody to an offsite collection facility. And so a lot of cost savings there. The process is quick and easy. You don't have to secure a bathroom by turning off the hot water or putting blue dye in the toilet water, etc. Very, very simple collection process. And then, as I talked about earlier, that tighter window of detection and the ability to detect recent use, very, very recent use. So let me show you a graphic that helps to explain those two issues. Okay, the window of detection is the period of time in which drugs are detectable in a sample that's been collected for drug testing. And so I put 5 different drug testing methods on the screen. Now, of course, breath testing for drugs doesn't really exist today. There's a lot of talk about it, but there are no products on the market. There's no technology that actually works yet. I think there may be in the future, but I want to put it on here because people talk about it. Then there's blood, which is really sort of impractical for workplace drug testing purposes and not even allowed in most states. And then oral fluid, urine, and hair, which are the 3 primary drug testing methods. Now look to the far left of the graphic there. You see breath, blood, and oral fluid right there, right after usage, okay? That's because in an oral fluid sample, just like with blood, you're detecting the parent drug and not a metabolite of the drug. And this becomes a critical factor when you look at some new laws that have been passed in California and Washington, which I'll get to in a minute. But with an oral fluid sample, you can detect the parent drug, which becomes detectable in saliva in an oral fluid sample within minutes after somebody smokes a joint, using marijuana as our example again. With urine, though, because we're not detecting the parent drug, we're detecting a metabolite of the drug. It takes 6-7 hours or so before the metabolite is detectable in a urine sample. With hair, we're talking about 7 to 10 days. And then a much broader window of detection up to 90 days. It doesn't mean that oral fluid is better than urine or hair is better than urine and oral fluid or anything like that. It depends on what your drug testing needs are. If you're concerned about recent use of drugs, somebody going out to their car and smoking a couple of joints during their lunch break and then coming back, the only drug testing method that's going to detect that, the only practical drug testing method is oral fluid. And the window of detection is going to be shorter. For most drugs, the window of detection is somewhere, let's say, between 24 and 48 hours. Lots of different studies out there. We could cite one or the other and come up with 24 to 48 hours. For THC, for cannabis, we're really looking at 10 to 12 hours, generally speaking. Again, lots of studies out there that might say it's a little bit longer, a little bit shorter. But if you're looking for a drug testing method that's capable of detecting very recent use, but has a tighter window of detection than urine, which is 3 to 4 days, or hair, which is 90 days, then oral fluid testing is a good match for what your needs are. Because if you're in a state like Colorado or Nevada, where marijuana, among many other states, has been legalized, and they place restrictions on what employers can do with a positive test for marijuana, you want a tighter window of detection. You don't want to be guessing at when the person used the drugs. You want to be able to have a drug test result that coincides basically with the aberrant, unsafe behavior that's taking place in the workplace. That's not to suggest that any drug testing method, including oral fluid, is proof of impairment. From a legal and a scientific standpoint, we can't make that statement. But the tighter window of detection and the ability to detect very recent drug use correlates more precisely with behavior that's taking place right now in the workplace. And that's one of the things that the federal government liked about oral fluid testing. The federal government is not saying that an oral fluid testing proves impairment, just that tighter window of detection and the ability to detect recent use aligns well with the priorities that some employers are going to have. Now, when it comes to marijuana, we also want to look at the window of impairment, not just the window of detection, but the window of impairment. And there's, again, a lot of studies out there on this topic. One that I like, that I think has become sort of the standard, is one that came out just a couple of years ago from the University of Sydney, where they didn't look at just one study on the window of impairment from cannabis. They looked at 80 different studies, and they came to the conclusion, these are 80 studies from all over the world, they came to the conclusion that the standard window of impairment for cannabis is about 3 to 10 hours, depending on a lot of different factors. How the person used the drug, how much of the drug they used, the THC component of the drug, that's the tetrahydrocannabinol, is the potency, that it's the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana that affects, the impairment of the individual. It's sometimes referred to as the potency level of the marijuana that's being used. Back in the 70s, the typical THC level in common marijuana was less than 10%. Nowadays, you can find it at 25, 30%, 50%. And in some places in Colorado, which has sort of become, sort of the capital of marijuana legalization, surpassing even California and Oregon and Washington, you can find cannabis there, marijuana with 80% THC levels. These are dangerous drugs now, but they're highly potent and highly impairing versions of marijuana. Now, let's look to the chart to the left there. I mentioned breath. Even though there aren't products on the market yet, let's compare it to oral fluid and urine. The window of detection for breath is usually about 2 to 3 hours. That means that anybody who's in the workplace beyond that 3-hour window of detection, who still has marijuana in their system and is potentially unsafe in the workplace, is not going to show up positive in a breath test. With urine, remember, we have that 6 to 7 hour lag time before the metabolite becomes detectable in a urine sample. So anybody before that 6th or 7th hour is not going to test positive in a urine test. The only drug testing method that covers the entire 3 to 10 hour window of impairment, according to the University of Sydney, is oral fluid testing. Within about 10 to 15 minutes after usage and beyond, even beyond, shortly beyond that 10-hour window of impairment. So that's one of the things that I think employers are very, very interested in, especially if you're in a state that has legalized marijuana. And I don't mean to focus on marijuana, over focus on marijuana, but it's really one of the driving factors when it comes to which drug testing method employers are going to be using in the future. The window of impairment is important because it helps you make that decision about which testing method is right for you. And when you understand the window of impairment and juxtapose it with the window of detection, you can find the testing method that aligns with your needs. If recent use detection and a tighter window of detection is important to you because you're in Colorado, then this is, oral fluid testing is the method for you. If you're looking at a broader window of detection with, that's going to show lifestyle drug usage, then yeah, you want to look at urine or hair testing. But for marijuana, I think we're going to find ourselves in a position where many state laws are going to sort of point employers toward oral fluid, either intentionally or unintentionally. So let's talk about state laws for a minute. And we're at about the halfway mark in the hour, and I plan to conclude leaving enough time for Q&A. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat section, and I promise we'll get to them. And if any we miss because we're out of time, we'll send an email out with responses to your questions. So just a quick primer on drug tests, state drug testing laws. There are mandatory laws, there's voluntary laws. There are some states with no law, no statute for drug testing, but they have case law. Then most states, virtually all states, have workers' comp and unemployment compensation regulations that tie back to drug testing. There are some states with industry-specific laws, mining industry, public works contractors, childcare providers, etc., that have very specific drug testing requirements for people in those industries. And then, of course, there are the medical and recreational marijuana laws, some of which, many of which, have very specific workplace language that may not dictate how drug testing occurs or when drug testing occurs, but has other language in those marijuana laws that affects drug testing. States that have anti-discrimination language in their marijuana law that defines employers acting solely on the basis of a positive test for marijuana as potentially discriminating against legal medical marijuana users, people who are registered card-carrying medical marijuana users. So all of these things that are on the screen right now, the mandatory and voluntary laws, et cetera, the case law, the workers' comp regulations, et cetera, that all comes into play when you look at drug testing laws and how they affect which drug testing method you use. Okay, so when it comes to oral fluid testing, virtually all states allow oral fluid testing. Now, virtually is a word that we sometimes use to avoid, going into all the detail of explaining which states don't fall into a category. When it comes to oral fluid testing, and we're talking about lab-based oral fluid testing, then Maine, Vermont, and Hawaii are problematic. I think now that the DOT regulations are out, we'll see Maine and Vermont in particular open the door for lab-based oral fluid testing. Hawaii's law is a little bit more stricter law, and it does allow point of collection oral fluid testing, but not lab-based oral fluid testing. That may change with the DOT regulations, but I think for sure Maine and Vermont will change. And in some ways, Maine's already done that. And somebody argued with me a week or so ago on a webinar that Vermont has already done that. And I'm okay with that. I don't mind when people contradict me, but it needs to be in writing before I can tell my clients that you can do it. But I think Maine and Vermont will open the door to lab-based oral fluid testing. When it comes to rapid result point of collection testing, possible in virtually every state, again, I'll use that word virtually, except possibly New York, unless you're working with a company that has been licensed for laboratory testing in that state, or possibly if you're using a drug testing method that has a reader device, like Casey talked about at the beginning, where an individual employee is not making the determination that the rapid result is positive or negative, but the reader system is doing that, and it's uploading the information to a central server somewhere, or delivering it to the employer on site. The point there is that I think many states like that, like California, like Minnesota, like New York, there's a workaround when it comes to the laboratory licensing law that in California's case, for example, doesn't even mention the workplace, but some people have interpreted it to be a workplace type of law. But the oral fluid, rapid result oral fluid reader system, I think solves that problem in many states. We asked Yvette Baker, one of our 2 on-staff attorneys, to look into that. She came to the conclusion that that solved the problem in Minnesota. We haven't really been asked to apply it to other states, but in Minnesota, I think that's not an issue. That's why we don't include Minnesota as a state that's problematic for oral fluid testing. But let me take you through a few examples right here. So I'm going to show you some voluntary laws and some mandatory laws, and New York with its laboratory licensing law. So Alabama is a state that has a voluntary law. Employers who choose to voluntarily participate in the state's program and drug test according to the dictates of the state qualify for a 5% workers' comp premium discount. Nice incentive for small companies that are not self-insured. Oral fluid, permitted under the voluntary law. POCT, not permitted under the voluntary law. However, outside of the voluntary law, there is no restriction on point of collection rapid result testing. So if you're in that program, there may be a prohibition on that, but the majority of employers in the state of Alabama, Florida, Tennessee, Georgia, the other states that have these voluntary laws, outside of the voluntary law, how you do drug tests, who you test, and when you test is not restricted by the components of the voluntary law. It only applies to the companies that voluntarily participate in that voluntary law. Arizona is another state that has a voluntary law, and oral fluid and point of collection oral fluid testing are allowed under the Arizona law. Specifically, and I included the language there to the right, nothing in this article shall be construed to encourage, discourage, restrict, limit, prohibit, or require on-site testing or alcohol impairment testing. Now, some drug testing laws are very old. Now, I wrote the very first book on state drug testing law in 1990 when I was at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And since then, it's sort of become my thing in the industry. Many state drug testing laws were written so long ago that they refer to rapid result or point of collection testing as on-site testing. But what they mean is a single-use disposable device that renders an immediate result or rapid result. And so that's the case in Arizona. Now, Connecticut is a state that has a mandatory law. And when it comes to specimens, it doesn't mention oral fluid. It neither overtly permits it or prohibits it. So we've concluded, as virtually everybody in the industry has, oral fluids allowed in Connecticut, and specifically point of collection testing is allowed in Connecticut. But you must confirm any presumptive positives that come from a rapid result test. You must send those results to a laboratory to be confirmed using gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, or GCMS. Minnesota, another state with a mandatory law, oral fluid permitted under, what type of test method can be used. It says all tests must take place in a certified lab, but we have looked into this, we've researched it locally, and we've come to the conclusion that a reader system qualifies the specific requirements that are in the Minnesota law. Be happy to walk you through that. Won't be time to do that today, but we'd be happy to share that with you, or contact Premier Biotech. They have a memo that we wrote on that. And then just finally under New York, they don't have a mandatory drug testing law, but they have a laboratory licensing law. It permits oral fluid. It on the surface would not allow point of collection testing, but again, we believe that a reader system solves that issue. So if we go to the two states I mentioned earlier, California and Washington, these two states have recently passed laws signed by the governors that have not gone into effect yet, but will soon at the end of the year, that make it unlawful for employers to discriminate against legal users of marijuana. So that's in hiring, termination, or any conditions of employment. If the discrimination is based on a drug test that reveals the presence of a quote unquote non-psychoactive metabolite of marijuana or cannabis. There are some exceptions in California. The construction industry is exempted from this law. But it means that in California, at least on the surface, the only drug testing methods you could use would be ones that identify the parent drug and not a metabolite. Now, the use of the term non-psychoactive metabolite is misleading because there's no way to determine between a metabolite that's active, non-psychoactive, or psychoactive. But that's the usage, the verbiage that they used in that law. The point is that with urine testing, the most popular testing method right now, it only detects a metabolite of cannabis. And therefore, you would have to use a drug testing method that identifies the parent drug. That would be blood or oral fluid right now, in terms of that tighter window of detection. You can detect the parent drug in hair, but it's not immediately detectable. So it wouldn't be, you couldn't use it as a rapid result test. In in Washington, forgive me, I was just in Washington, SB 5123 is very, very similar to California's SB 2188. except there are many, many more exceptions, many more safety sensitive occupations and industries that have been exempted from this prohibition on testing methods that identify metabolites of cannabis. And keep in mind, in California, it's all testing of employees. In Washington, it's just pre-employment testing. And it only applies to marijuana. It doesn't apply to other drugs. So for example, in Oregon, where they've decriminalized all dangerous drugs, including cocaine and heroin, if they pass a law similar to California and Washington, it wouldn't apply to those other drugs. It just applies to cannabis. That's the justification, that cannabis is legal, therefore employers should be restricted in discriminating against legal users. Okay, now we just have a few minutes and I want to get to a couple of points real quickly, but ask your questions on those state laws. I'd be happy to answer them. I put a chart in here that compares urine and oral fluid testing. There's one just for urine, and then there's one just for oral fluid testing, and then there's one that compares urine, oral fluid, hair, and blood. Let me go back to these two previous slides just for a minute. There are pros and cons to every drug testing method, or really better put, advantages and disadvantages, but those advantages and disadvantages depend on your circumstances as an employer or your client's circumstances. Urine testing has been established as the gold standard, been around forever. You can test for lots of different drugs. It's legal in every state. It's permitted under the DOT regulations. It's been challenged legally and scientifically, and it's withstood all those tests of time, all the tests of time for those, especially if you're following established guidelines, either by a state law or by a federal regulation. And it's available for both lab and POC testing. But it's also subject to cheating and adulteration. Collections are a hassle. Some people consider dealing with somebody else's urine to be yucky. That's the term that was used in our survey years ago. There's the shy bladder problem, where people can't void a sample for lots of different reasons, sometimes medical reasons. And there's that lag time of 6 to 7 hours, the fact that it's not able to detect recent use. That's an issue with urine testing. With oral fluid testing, it's all the things I've already talked about, and then some things. Now go down a little bit. It eliminates shy bladder, of course, but go down to the bullet before that. On-site testing reduces time away from work and improves productivity, because if you choose to, the collections are so easy to do that you can do them right there in the workplace, either with a professional technician doing it or trained employees to observe the process, which reduces time away from work to visit an offsite collection facility, and that affects positively productivity in the workplace. And now, if you go down the last bullet, it's been endorsed by SAMHSA and DOT. And you remember that language that I read from SAMHSA on the scientific stability or viability of oral fluid testing. Lab-based oral fluid testing is possibly not permitted in the 3 states I mentioned, so that's something we need to deal with going forward. There is such a thing as dry mouth syndrome. It's rare, but it can happen. And then an employer under the DOT regulations, once they go into full effect, would be able to switch back to a urine sample, or in a shy bladder situation, fast forward to an oral fluid test instead. But right now, and then the last bullet, because I think this is important, is that sort of the gold standard for point of collection testing will be using an FDA cleared device. And contact your representatives at Premier Biotech about Oral Tox, because it's one of the few FDA cleared devices that's on the market. I'm going to give you this to look at. You'll have time to go through it at your leisure, but this compares the 4 drug testing methods that I've spent most of the time talking about today on all the key issues that you see there. But let me spend a little bit of time in my closing minutes talking about putting together a pilot program. So I think we'll see a lot more companies either adding or including oral fluid testing in their drug testing or drug-free workplace programs, either in addition to urine or in place of urine testing. But I think a lot of that for many companies is going to start with a pilot program where you take 30 days, let's say, at 3 to 5, high volume locations, and try it out. Kind of like test driving a car. before I buy the car, I want to try it out, see how it feels on the road. And then once I do that, I'm going to be ready to spend my money. So when you put together a pilot program, you of course want to designate one person as the point person for your program, but I highly recommend putting together a decision-making team that's going to assess the progress of the pilot program over that 30-day or so period of time. You don't really need a lot more than 30 days, but you don't want something less than 30 days because you need a specific period of time that's long enough to really judge how the program works in those 3 to 5 high volume locations where you're going to do several thousand tests during that period of time, with a specific start date and stop date, and then very importantly, mutually agreed upon success factors, criteria for success between you and the provider, the company that you're doing the pilot program with. Now, I won't go through all of this, but your provider has certain obligations when you put a pilot program together. They're really responsible for training you and the people that are going to be managing your program, even your decision-making team, so that when they see oral fluid testing taking place, they know what's going on, including the people that are perhaps going to be collectors or observers of oral fluid collections in the workplace. So you're going to want to train all of those people, and then you're going to want periodic check-ins during the 30 days so that you can sort of judge how the program's going in terms of how many tests are being conducted, what's taking place with presumptive positives, are we getting them to laboratory in a timely fashion, are we solving any problems that come up and looking for ways to solve those problems as we go along. In the end, you're going to judge the effectiveness of your pilot program by how well it saved time, how well it saved money, and whether or not it made your overall drug-free workplace program more effective. And for many companies, especially in pre-employment situations, you're going to judge effectiveness by how many hire-worthy people you were able to bring on board the day you tested them versus the way you're doing it now, where maybe it's 2, 3, 4 days before you can make an official job offer. Maybe you've made a conditional job offer, but you can't really make the final job offer until you get that drug test result back. With rapid result oral fluid testing, in many cases, the majority of cases are going to be negative results. You're going to be able to extend that official job offer, and you're going to want to judge the effectiveness of your program by how that compares to sort of the traditional way that you've been doing it, especially in a pre-employment testing program where that's really the primary issue. So in conclusion, I think you're going to see a lot of companies transition to oral fluid testing. SAMHSA estimated that within the federal government, about 30% of employers in the federal government would transition to oral fluid testing after 4 years, and about the same under the DOT regulations. But if you go down to that last bullet, if 46% of surveyed providers are now offering oral fluid testing and predicting that it's going to be one of the most used testing method or the most used testing method in the future, then I think 30% is probably a low estimate for the transition period that we'll eventually see when it comes to oral fluid testing. Rapid result oral fluid testing, I think, has an appeal, again, to companies in safety sensitive industries that operate in remote locations and where there's a lot of turnover, where being able to hire people quickly with same-day hiring practices becomes very important. It's possible to conduct the collection easily, anywhere, anytime, without the threat of drug test cheating taking place, and making it, a means to keep drug testing, even in pro-marijuana states, that's problematic with urine or hair testing. Again, I love urine and hair testing. I just think in certain situations, you'll find that rapid result oral fluid testing meets the needs a little bit more effectively than traditional drug testing methods. And I think we'll see a big transition to oral fluid testing in the coming years. Now, with that, let's turn it over to Jessica with questions. And if you have any specific questions for Casey, she's still online as well, so we can answer any types of questions you have. Again, if there are questions we don't get to today, we'll write out answers to them and send them to everybody. So, Jessica, what kind of questions do we have from our audience?
Great, thank you, Bill. To start, we've had a couple of questions phrased variously to this point. How does the cost of oral fluid testing compare to traditional urine testing?
Well, the way that I would answer is I look at it as the hard dollar cost of drug testing and the soft dollar cost of drug testing. Oral fluid testing is very comparable to urine testing when you're doing a lab test, very comparable process, and rapid result testing can be even less expensive. But once you involve the lab, it's very similar price-wise. But you're going to save a little bit of money on the rapid result device in many instances, okay? The majority of those on-site rapid result tests are going to be negative. Just maybe 4 to 5% are going to be presumptive positives, and that's going to involve a laboratory. But where the real cost saving comes in is in the soft dollars. Not having to send an individual to an offsite collection site where 60% in one study of job applicants never even showed up at the collection site. And so as an employer, you're interviewing X number of people, maybe 10, 12, 20 people for every person you end up hiring. And I shouldn't say interviewing, you're falling in love with 20 potential ideal employees, but you're only getting to one of them because a lot of those people never even show up at the collection site. And the time that it would take to send a supervisor to a collection site with an employee who's been injured in an accident or who's suspected of drug use, that cost is significant. If you look at just the average hourly rate of a supervisor being, say, $40 an hour, you know, before all the other things are added on, and they're gone for 2 to 3 hours, that employee's missed work, that supervisor's missed work, and other employees have had to fill in behind them. So when you look at the return on investment dollar-wise from drug testing, no matter what method you're looking at, but especially in the case of rapid oral fluid testing, I think you want to look at both the hard dollars, of course, but the soft dollars as well to get your true ROI from that drug testing method.
Our next question, and this is also coming in a couple different ways, so let me try and like phrase it together. Don't some state laws require collectors to have specific credentials? Wouldn't this eliminate most employees from collecting oral fluid samples? How will they address collecting for this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me answer it this way. Very few states have those specific requirements, but some do. And many states with voluntary drug testing laws, like Florida, where I live, do have those requirements when it comes to who can collect a sample or who can conduct a test even. And so there are some states where you want to look at that, but keep in mind under the voluntary laws, those restrictions only apply to companies that participate in the voluntary programs, which are you know, a small percentage of the total number of employers who conduct drug testing in any given state. For one reason, it's because there are certain conditions that apply that an employer would have to meet before they can be admitted into the program. And it also does not typically allow self-insured companies to participate in the program, right? Because we're talking about state-run workers' comp funds. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But the other thing to keep in mind is that many of the states that specifically sort of quote unquote dictate who can collect a specimen have sort of a catch-all component to that verbiage or language that sort of opens it up to the people who typically do collections at a patient service center or a third-party collection site. And so even though that language does exist and it's legitimate, so I don't want to downplay it, it really doesn't restrict collecting an oral fluid sample in the workplace under most circumstances. Now, I do want to come to one related issue, and you know, I've got Casey on the line. So Casey, if there's at any point there's something you want to add, please feel free to jump in. But remember earlier in my presentation, I referred to something Casey described at the beginning, which is a reader system. So a reader system is one that reads the result of the rapid result test as opposed to the employee doing it, a trained employee even. And so you're taking and I don't want to call it guesswork because it's not guesswork. You're, in most cases, especially if you're using an FDA cleared device like Oral Tox, you're getting an accurate, legitimate result that is clear to be seen by any employee who looks at it. Of course, you're only going to have the collector and perhaps the donor that are going to see it. But the reader device renders the result. It takes that out of the hands of the employee and does it for the employer. It renders the result. And in many cases, that's going to sort of eliminate the biggest concern when it comes to collections. The other thing that you'll find in many of these laws that, and there aren't many, but the laws that do have language about who can conduct a collection, is that those laws were written really in the days when urine testing was really the only alternative. I'm not saying that that language does not apply to oral fluid collections, because it's what's on the books right now. But the language was specifically created for oral or for urine testing and urine sample collections because of the complexity that is inherent in the collection of a urine sample. I mean, there's just so much involved in that that goes away with the typical oral fluid sample collection. So take it with a grain of salt. Don't dismiss it. It's a legitimate issue, but understand and then look at it at a case-by-case level and have your company attorney look at it for you as well. And I think he or she will come to the conclusions that I've just mentioned, that in most cases, it wouldn't affect on-site testing, especially rapid result oral fluid testing, where many of those collection complexities that are typical of urine testing really go away for the most part.
Okay, thank you very much. And we just have a couple more minutes left. I know it's probably on a lot of people's mind, and you mentioned it earlier in the presentation, having to do with DOT. And so the first question, and we'll see if we have time for both of them, when will the DOT regulations actually become usable?
Okay, so they've gone into effect June 1st. They'll become usable when there are at least 2 laboratories certified by SAMHSA to conduct oral fluid testing. And that's really sort of the bugaboo right now, because under the SAMHSA guidelines, there's only a urine certification that many laboratories qualify for. There are other certifications out there, like the College of American Pathologists. They have that. CAP has certifications for oral fluid testing also, and I believe for hair testing. But under the DOT regulations, it's going to require a SAMHSA certified lab, and there aren't 2 labs certified yet. But once that happens, we'll be well on our way to having very usable guidelines for DOT covered employers. In the meantime, non-DOT covered employers can rely on other types of laboratory certifications, either from a state or under some other certifying body, to begin using laboratories to confirm rapid result oral fluids tests.
Okay, wonderful. That's a great response to that question. And so we are coming up on the top of the hour, and so we wanted to just give you one last second if you wanted to add anything else, Bill, before we wrap up, or if Casey wanted to share anything before we wrap up this meeting.
Casey, anything from you?
Thank you again. We really appreciate the opportunity to continue to partner with Bill and his team, and look forward to hosting more of these in the future.
Yeah, and I'll just say in conclusion, I just think that, having worked on this issue for many years now, it's an exciting time in the history of drug testing and the drug testing industry. And I think that oral fluid testing is going to, prove to be just as valid in every possible way as urine testing, which is a great way to test. But I think oral fluid testing is really sort of aligns well with where we're going as a nation culturally, as well as where employers are going in terms of workplace challenges that they're facing. Oral fluid testing represents a way for employers to continue to test and to get the benefits of drug testing while meeting sort of these changes that are occurring in our country right now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Casey, and thank you, Bill. On behalf of Current Consulting Group and Premier Biotech, we thank you for your attendance in today's webinar. As a quick reminder, we do have continuing education credits for those of you who've stayed with us for the entire presentation. We'll email you when we email you the link to the recording. We'll also send out that continuing education credit information for those who've qualified, so you don't have to do another step. You just look for our email. And then also we'll be, as I said, sending out the recording. So if you have any questions after today's webinar that you would like to ask for Premier Biotech or Current Consulting Group, we'd be happy to receive those questions. This concludes today's webinar presentation. Thank you and have a great day.